LiSTNR production.
A warning. This episode has graphic descriptions of child abuse and infant loss. Please listen with care. Welcome to Crime Insiders Forensics. For those joining us for the first time, my name's Kathryn Fox. I'm a former GP, crime author and screenwriter. I'm enthralled by forensics and have spent thousands of hours researching for books and screenplays. So I thought, why not turn my research into a podcast? Every week, you'll be joining me in discovering how forensic science is helping solve high-profile crimes in Australia and around the world. This week, what happens to the truth when the experts can't agree?
Because we pretend to have certainty where there is none, we're harming innocent people.
Heartbreaking was the only word that could be used to describe the death of a 10-month-old baby in Perth. What was less clear-cut is the question that was posed to the judge. Was the baby boy's death an accident, or was he murdered by his own father? Shaken baby syndrome is one of the most divisive areas in forensic science and the law. Some experts argue that the diagnosis is key to convicting people guilty of child abuse. Others say the diagnosis is misunderstood and responsible for the incarceration of innocent people.
Which is why lawyers should become instant experts in anything they're doing that involves science.
Judith Fordham has been lauded as one of Western Australia's most high-profile criminal lawyers. But what sets her apart from her colleagues is her dual expertise in law and forensics. Judith's unique skill set has seen her represent clients whose cases have a strong forensic element, especially cases where the law hasn't yet caught up with the science. To begin, Judith shares what led her down this unique path.
I had a science degree in basically biological sciences, so, sort of medically related. And I was lucky enough to have done that under the Whitlam government, which some of your listeners might be old enough to remember.
Or alive for.
Alive for, yeah. So I didn't have to pay to go to university. And then about 10 years later, I, in fact, had a marriage breakup, and I thought, what am I going to do now? I had 4 kids, 3 of them were under 5. I know, I'll do another degree. So I thought, what am I going to do? And the only second degree you could actually get any government funding for was law, because people do, commerce law or arts law. So it was considered okay. So I ended up as being one of those very rare people who had science background and understood the whole concepts of scientific proof and, what a fact is and what a fact isn't. And then also had the law qualifications, because back in the olden days, you did law if you didn't understand maths, and, you did science if you couldn't communicate. And now I've offended probably everybody in the entire universe. But, huge generalisation, that's what you did. And then all of a sudden, having got a law degree and started practice as a lawyer, this thing called DNA started happening. And it's like, whoa, I actually understand this. How you get people to check your work, but the way you get them to check the work is you tell them what the answer is first, then you get them to check it, then you wonder why they come up with the same result. So I started wrapping my head around all of this, and I suddenly realised that it was probably a good idea to do those sorts of cases, because it's a particular way of thinking that I'd learnt, but an awful lot of other lawyers hadn't. And that's not big noting me, I just happen to have the right background, right place, right time.
Well, you wonder why it actually isn't more obvious that it would benefit lawyers when science is so involved in criminal trials today.
But you have to know what you don't know. You've got to recognise that. I remember sitting through a case, because I've done some jury research, and I probably should also say I've done some postgraduate forensic training as well. But I remember sitting through this case as part of my research, and this chap was cross-examining a police computer expert, and he was asking him what I thought was some very, very silly questions, like what else was on the hard drive of this computer? It was a yucky sort of case about having illegal pornographic images on the computer. What else was on the hard drive you haven't told us about, officer? And the police computer expert was saying, I don't really think you want me to answer that question, trying to give him a hint that maybe he was going into territory that maybe wasn't good. In the end, the lawyer said to the judge, make the officer answer that question. Go on. And the officer basically said, all right, and then proceeded to say what else was on the computer, which was incredibly damaging. And I said to the lawyer afterwards, I said, did you get anyone to even, to look at the hard drive? I tried not to sound critical. Did you get anyone to even, check the material? He said, no, he said, I don't need to do that. Or understand how the computer forensic expert went about his work. No, I don't need to do that. I'm a lawyer. I just need to cross-examine and the truth will come out. It's like, no, it won't.
But with leading questions.
Yeah.
Isn't the old adage that a lawyer should never ask a question they don't know the answer to?
That is the old adage. I've broken it lots and lots of times, and I'm sure we'll come up with some of that today. But you should at least do your homework. But to do that, you've got to know. You've got to recognise it. And I've had so many cases that have come to me where no one's even realised that the way to deal with this particular matter is by looking at the forensics, because it's the tipping point. It's never the only evidence, but it can be the tipping point. Well, it really helps if you have a look and see whether there's any faults with it, whether it can be relied upon. And science is always in a state of flux.
And it's like anything, you have to stay up to date.
Yeah.
And you'd think that lawyers and scientists would all be staying up to date, particularly if these issues like DNA keep coming up in trials and are so essential to how juries are perceiving the evidence that they're hearing and having to make decisions on.
And you've got to be able to explain it. I mean, I spend a lot of my time teaching lawyers how to wrap their heads around the science, but teaching scientists how to communicate their science, because it's all very well to have, certain results from your DNA, for example, but you've got to be able to communicate what that actually means. Just because there's a big number doesn't mean he did it, for example. The big number, it depends on all the circumstances. How could the DNA have got there? And, could it have been transferred from somebody else? What were the procedures in the lab? Could the sample have been contaminated? All those sort of questions that are obvious to a scientist, but maybe not so obvious to someone without science training.
But I think we'd all love to have gotcha science.
Yeah.
But it's not that simple, is it?
No, but science can be very impressive. And, juries are now more willing to wrap their heads around science. That's good and bad. Forensic science, any science, if you ask a true scientist in the witness box, could you be wrong? They're always going to have to say yes, because the whole point of science is the way you become more certain is by continually trying to prove yourself wrong. And the more you can't prove yourself wrong, the more likely what you're thinking is to be true. Whereas with many criminal investigations and prosecutions, what the prosecution is doing is choosing the evidence and presenting the evidence that makes their particular theory correct, and either ignoring, in some terrible cases, covering up or not disclosing that evidence. And their brains are tuning out anything that contradicts their
narrative.
Their narrative. And then that finds its way into court, where the prosecution gives the jury a particular version of events because they get to go first. And there's been a lot of psychological study done on the fact that juries then, once they start hearing from the defence, keep trying to fit it into the prosecution narrative and reject it when it doesn't.
So whoever gets the first story has the more credibility in a jury's mind.
Yep. But then you've got another thing, and that is the last person to be heard, which is the defence, sits in the mind, so longer and better. So it's it all interacts.
But you've also got, surely with the prosecution, you've got them using state scientists or employed scientists and police, whereas the defence then has the ability, if they have the funds, to then expert search and then find a particular expert who may fit the narrative they're trying to present as a defence.
Well, that's not quite right. Certainly with DNA, yes, they have state-employed scientists, and with forensic pathology, they do. But let's say it's something like biomechanics, the physics of bodies falling through space, or car accident injuries, that sort of thing. You know, there may well not be a government body that does that sort of work. So the prosecution can and does go out and find scientists, and human nature being what it is, quite often they'll choose those that say something that fits their narrative. And they've got more money.
How do we look at then cases that there have been convictions or acquittals that are just so confusing? And if experts can't agree, how does anyone find the truth?
Well, that's right. And when the science is under active research, where, I mean, I've had cases like, for example, something called shaken baby syndrome, where 1 year my client might be guilty because of the state of knowledge of science that year. 2 or 3 years later, he might be not guilty because the science has changed. Now, how can that be right?
Well, we found that with sudden infant death syndrome too.
Yes.
And lack of evidence to prove what were thought to be laws, scientific laws, that didn't have the evidence to back it. Like we were talking about Meadows' law.
Yeah.
Which Kathleen Fox, we've talked about her before, and she was convicted of being involved in the deaths of her four children.
Yeah.
And after serving 20 years, she was released because of new scientific evidence and new interpretation of evidence.
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing is that both shaken baby syndrome and sudden infant death syndrome are called syndromes. And syndrome really means you've got this collection of symptoms that seem to go together somehow, but we really don't understand the process. We don't understand the cause and effect. We just know they seem to turn up together.
It's not a diagnosis.
No, it's absolutely not a diagnosis. And the only reason, for example, with sudden infant death syndrome, this thing was known as Meadows' law, was the courts, the lawyers dubbed it a law. It's not a law. We just don't know. We're learning and we continue to learn. And what happened with Professor Sir Roy Meadow, I mean, how impressive is that? You have someone rock into court called Professor Sir. I mean, everything he says must be true.
Reeks of authority.
Doesn't it? Yeah. And his Meadows' so-called law was with Sid's deaths. 1 is a tragedy, 2 is suspicious, and 3 is murder. That is within the same family. So if you have 3 children die that way, Meadows' law said it was murder. And he got to that by simply multiplying the odds of one Sid's death in a family, squaring it, multiplying it by itself for 2, and cubing it, multiplying it by itself twice, to get this enormous number that really showed it had to be murder. But what he didn't know, because he wasn't qualified, he didn't have the learning. And that's the other problem, just digressing for a minute. People will rock up as experts and then start talking about stuff they don't know about. But because the court said you're an expert, they go to town. And he did this. He had no qualifications or knowledge of statistics, for example. So what happened was the Royal Society of Statisticians in the UK actually went, public and said, this guy shouldn't be saying this. It's simply not true. By which time there'd been untold damage done to untold families. Mothers had been imprisoned. Families had been broken up. Children had been fostered out. And some of these mothers didn't even get their children back because they were happily ensconced in a foster family, or because this man, who was struck off for what he did and then eventually unstruck off, whatever the term is.
Reinstated.
Thank you. All because he didn't have a clue about statistics and yet blithely went into court and said all this stuff. So a little knowledge is a dangerous thing, I suppose, and the deference we pay to experts is not always warranted, which is why lawyers should become instant experts in anything they're doing that involves science, which ain't easy.
There were also concepts that used to be considered like you could scare someone to death.
I've had a trial like that.
Can you tell us about that one?
Well, yes, without identifying anybody, obviously. But it was a situation where a chap had a loud party at his place and the neighbour got very upset and the two of them about 7 o'clock in the morning, because the party went all night, and I have to say the neighbour was probably well justified in being upset, had a very loud argument and came to a bit of a push and shove both ways. Nothing hugely serious, but, a bit of an assault both ways. And then the neighbour died of a heart attack, a myocardial infarction, a heart attack, just dropped dead. And my client was charged with murdering him because it was said that the stress involved in this altercation caused the heart attack. The medical question was the only question in the whole trial. And the question was whether stress on that occasion caused that heart attack.
But that's asking doctors to actually diagnose a crime.
Yep.
Not a medical diagnosis or a cause of death.
Well, effectively it is. Effectively that's the result, because in that case that was really the only thing in dispute. So the prosecution had an expert who rocked up and said, I'm a cardiologist and I'm saying absolutely that this stress caused this man to die. It turned out on the post-mortem that he had coronary artery disease that nobody knew about. So his coronary arteries were very narrow, and really I was defending, but he was a death waiting to happen. And it hadn't been diagnosed, so he was taking no precautions. So he was a walking time bomb. And science works generally on experiments, okay? And you take 1,000 cases like this and you do certain things and you change this and see what happens. But you can't take like 2,000 people with heart conditions and try to scare them all to death and see how many of them die.
Especially ones that don't know about their heart condition.
Exactly. It's considered unethical for some reason. I don't
Not
quite understand. And so my argument, because I couldn't find anyone who would give evidence for the defence, and that's something we haven't covered, is, of course, giving defence evidence in a murder trial is not a popular thing for a doctor to do, because prosecution are the goodies and the defence are the baddies. So I found someone who did want to give evidence, but he was told by his employer that if he gave evidence, he'd be out of a job. So I just learned all I could from him, and then I had to go it alone, cross-examining this expert. And I said to the expert, how do you know? He said, there's been all these studies, and he'd, like after the earthquake in Newcastle many years ago, after bombings overseas, there was a peak in deaths written as being from heart attacks. But when you think about it, let's say there's been a bombing or there's been an earthquake and emergency departments are overrun, people are coming in. If somebody comes in and they're dead but they don't have a mark on them, what are you going to do? You're going to tick the box saying a heart attack. You're not going to do a post-mortem to find out for sure because you're too busy saving lives. And so this apparent increase in heart attack deaths, is it real or isn't it? Well, we just don't know because no one ever looked. So I said to him, how can that be? You just can't know. And I said, look at this article you've given us. I said, I've read that article. And it doesn't say stress inevitably causes heart attacks all the time. It says we need to do more research. And I said, have you read the footnotes to that article? Because these articles come with lots of footnotes referring to other articles. And he's like, no. I said, well, I have. And I said, all of these authors say we don't really know. So how can you say you know? And you know what he said? He said, they're all lying. They're all academics and they wouldn't get any funding for further research if they said we know the answer. So they're lying.
And how did a jury perceive that?
Well, I didn't get to talk to the jury. Let's just say my client was acquitted, and so he should have been. But I think the scientific word for it is I was gobsmacked when he said that. I could not believe it. And that's what happens when experts' egos get involved, because experts are human too and they don't want to resile from their position, certainly not from a smart aleck lawyer who actually seems to have read what he wrote. But it was lucky that I did do the research, because that was the only way, at least, not knowing what the jury thought, of course, but the only way at least that I could challenge him was to have done the work. And that's the scary bit.
From your point of view, have there been a lot of miscarriages of justice because of science at a particular point in time?
I think there's been more than we'll ever know, and that's really sad. uncovering it depends upon resources. It depends upon people not giving up. It depends upon people getting it wrong or right in the first place. I mean, I had someone come to me once who'd actually been convicted of murder, done his time, released from jail, was refused in certain careers because he had a conviction for murder. It's not a great thing to put on your CV. How do you account for the last, 20 years I've been in jail? It's not great to get jobs that way. So his whole life had been ruined. And it was a very similar situation where he'd broken into someone's house as a youth, and yes, what he did was wrong, but this person died of a bleeding ulcer. And it was back in the days when it was absolute received wisdom. It was considered a fact. You might correct me here, but in the medical profession, that stress causes ulcers.
It was called a stress ulcer.
Well, there you go. And just at that time when the trial was happening, there were two scientists actually in Western Australia called Barry Marshall and Robin Warren, who were looking at whether ulcers were caused by some other way, namely a bacterial infection. They actually won the Nobel Prize for their work because it turned out that is in the case with duodenal ulcers. And the way Barry Marshall found that out was, again, because you can't go around trying to give, feeding bacteria to people and seeing if they get ulcers, because that's, again, considered somewhat uncool. So he did it himself. He fed himself a mixture with this bacterium in, got an ulcer, cured himself with antibiotics, and there you go, Nobel Prize. Stress doesn't cause ulcers. It's a form of bacterial infection. And this jury in this particular trial, because this chap came to me with, his files and material, the jury had actually written, as I understand it, either to the judge or one of the lawyers, and I've seen the actual letter. It was from the foreman of the jury. He said, "We've convicted him, but we're not easy about it because we've heard that there's some research currently going on about what causes ulcers, but we didn't hear any medical evidence about that. And we've been told that for our verdict, we only rely on what we've heard in court," and that's true, that's the law. "And we didn't hear anything other than the stress of this attack caused the ulcer and the chap died. So we were forced to convict, but we know there's something out there and we really wish we'd been told about it." Now, if that's not a huge injustice, nothing is.
So the jury did the wrong thing for the right reason, because that's
right.
what they'd been told.
And they knew, they felt they were doing the wrong thing, but nobody had presented them with this other evidence that obviously some of them had heard about and later on proved to be correct. I mean, that's such a sad story, and this has ruined this guy's life for, what was a youthful crime that he could have put behind him. It's just so sad.
Can you go back and get him the conviction reversed or
Well, in the
overturned?
end, that he was cleared, but this is 40 years down the track. And those sort of things are still happening today because no one's thought or no one's realised that there are alternative points of view out there in the world of science. People seem to think science is certain because it's science, and that's the very thing it isn't. It's never certain.
The whole point of science is that when you get more information, you change your viewpoint.
That's right. Yeah. And you don't shut your mind to that new information. You don't write it off because it doesn't suit what you think. You explore it. And, scientists are always or should always be prepared to change their viewpoint depending upon what they now know.
It's never absolute, is what you're saying.
That's exactly what I'm saying. Thank you.
What was the case, the specific case? Obviously, this was very important to you, this case and this trial.
Yeah.
And has had a massive impact on you, personally and professionally. What was the case?
I've got to say, for me, it brought everything together, and I've literally never forgotten it. It was a case where a young couple had two children, a little girl who was a toddler and a 10-month-old baby boy. And they were just average suburban young couple. The baby boy was sort of that age where, babies start getting the sniffles and things. They're sort of losing the sort of immunity that they got from their mother, and they're starting to come down with, fevers and sniffles and that general...
Mixing with other little kids as well.
Yeah.
And a sister who's older and probably playdating.
At kindy or whatever. Yeah. So the baby boy had been ill for a couple of weeks, been to the GP, been prescribed a drug which I later found out was what they call contraindicated for children under 2. In other words, you shouldn't give it to children under 2 because it had been implicated, wait for it, in SIDS deaths. It's a small world. And so I found out all sorts of stuff. But anyway, going back to how it started, they'd had the baby to outpatients a couple of times because he was running a fever, being prescribed, Panadol or whatever. Then one day when father was alone looking after the little boy, he had what father described as a fit, and he rang 000. I've actually heard the call. That's part of why this sticks with me, because this is so real. And of course, I've got 4 children myself. Hearing that call and hearing the baby breathing in the background, this very laboured, sort of stertorous breathing, and what you're hearing is a dying baby. So you get emotional. I get emotional. Everyone in the case got emotional because it became a case. What happened was the baby went to hospital. There were heroic efforts made to save his life, but after 2 days it became obvious that he couldn't be brought back. And they turned off life support and the baby died in father's arms. 20 minutes later, father was being interviewed by the police. And after they'd gone home, tried to get on with their lives, 9 months later, the father was charged with murdering his son. Why 9 months later? Because there had to be some neuropathology done and there were delays because there was only one person who could do the work and her workload was very, very backed up. So it was 9 months before the police charged him. He was charged with murder. He was put straight into custody. So there he is, having virtually not had he may have had a traffic ticket, you know what I mean? He's got no criminal background at all. There he is, locked up, labelled baby killer. So he was Mr. Popularity in prison. And he stayed locked up for nearly 2 years waiting for trial. And I was the person who ended up with that particular case. And it's probably the biggest challenge I've ever had in my professional life.
Why was he charged?
He was charged because this baby showed what they call a triad of symptoms, which was said in medical school to every trainee doctor when they did their lectures involving that sort of thing. It means the child's been deliberately shaken. Deliberate, not accidentally, hasn't had a fall. And the symptoms were, 2 of them were bleeding symptoms like hemorrhages in the eye, retinal hemorrhages, subdural hematoma, in other words, bleeding under the lining of the brain, and brain swelling, which is said to come from injury to the nerve fibres, if you like, in the brain. And those 3 signs had to be shaken baby and nothing else, and that's what everybody learned. And the forensic pathologist, so the neuropathologist looked at it, found damage to the nerve fibres. The bleeding signs were there. An ophthalmologist looked at the signs in the eyes because there's said to be a particular pattern, and he gave an opinion that, yes, this was that particular pattern. And so the forensic pathologist gave an opinion that this was the cause of death, deliberate shaking. And so he was charged. He was charged because of basically the medical evidence and the fact that he had no explanation, even though the law says it's the prosecution that has to prove a case beyond a reasonable doubt. And in many situations, you can't prove you didn't do something. If you told me you'd seen me, walking across the Harbour Bridge yesterday, I probably couldn't prove I wasn't. But that doesn't mean I was.
So purely because it was always assumed that a child with those triad of symptoms had to have been abused. That's why anyone then whose child had those triad of symptoms would be charged.
That's right. And don't forget it's called shaken baby syndrome. Syndrome means we actually don't understand it properly. But that somehow gets lost. It's seen by, I guess, the lawyers and the police as a diagnosis. This had to have happened. When I saw this case, it was just like, I'm not an expert in any of this stuff. I've got to learn something about neuropathology. I've got to learn something about hematology, bleeding. I've got to learn something about ophthalmology. I've got to learn something about biomechanics, what happens, because this is said to have been caused because you have a child whose head is heavy relative to its body, its neck muscles aren't particularly well developed, you get angry at the child, you lose the plot with the child because it's whingy and moaning and it's been, unwell or whatever. You grab the child around the body, you shake it hard, the head rocks backwards and forwards violently, the brain effectively rattles around in the skull. I mean, it's a very unscientific way of putting it, but you get my drift. And that's said to cause those injuries. And the scary thing about that is I think any parent can relate to that as well. I think there's many's the time that I've wanted to strangle my kids, but I didn't.
I just want them to stop crying.
Exactly. And you're short of sleep and you're stressed and you don't know what to do. And so to a jury, they could relate to that feeling without ever having done it. So the prosecution can present this man as otherwise a very good man who just lost the plot.
And didn't necessarily need a motive.
That's right, yeah, because it just happened. And that's a very seductive form of reasoning. So I got this case and I thought, where am I going to start? And it was legally aided, which meant that there was very little in the way of funding. And certainly my funding for my work ran out after probably a couple of weeks or something. But once you take something on, you don't drop it and say, oh, too bad, the money's run out. First thing I did was start reading about shaken baby syndrome. And I found some articles, in journals like the British Medical Journal and the New England Journal of Medicine. And you'll back me up here. They are very reputable journals. You don't get something published in there unless it's got,
It's had stringent review.
Yeah, they're well-respected journals. And some of the newer work was starting to say, maybe you don't need quite this degree of force. Because one of the things also these doctors were taught is the force is equivalent to throwing the child from a second-story window or the force involved in a 60-kilometre-per-hour car crash. But started learning that it's actually impossible for an adult human to exert that sort of force on a baby. People have just been saying it forever, therefore it's become true. It's what you learn, and therefore it's true. No one's actually stopped to check, and you pass it on. And you simply can't do that. But putting that to one side, there are a couple of English researchers who were now starting to say maybe that amount of force isn't needed. Maybe the sort of force, if there's been force used at all, could be from accidental things like falling from a high chair or something like that. And then later on, one of these researchers also started saying, and maybe these symptoms, particularly the bleeding symptoms, could have come about just from the brain swelling. Because, for example, with the hemorrhages in the retina, the brain and the eyes are connected. They're part of the same system. So pressure in the brain could actually produce this sign, and pressure in the brain could produce, little breaks in the capillaries which could produce this bleeding. Maybe it doesn't even need to be any force. So this was all happening at the time.
But you also said too that the child had a fever, and respiratory infections are so common in young kids.
Yes.
Coughing can actually cause petechial hemorrhages.
That's
my
right.
understanding.
Yeah.
And just thinking, if, a child think they're choking or they're coughing and a parent slaps the back or tries to dislodge what they think is in their throat.
Yep.
Because in children, airways, breathing, circulation, it's airway, airway. Yeah. That's the very first thing you look at for a child who's not breathing properly.
And the father had done first aid training, and that's exactly what he did. He put the child up over his shoulder and sort of whacked it between the shoulder blades, which could have produced the head movement. But also the child had been ill, and I think we've all heard of febrile convulsions where little kids have a convulsion just because they've got a fever, and if they have a convulsion, they can stop breathing. Stopping breathing means that the blood supply, the oxygen to the brain is compromised, and that can cause brain swelling all by itself with no force at all. So is that what happened? So we've already got a couple of thoughts about how else this could have happened other than the way the prosecution said. And finding these articles was the key. I then sent them to the prosecution forensic pathologist and I said, have you read these? And I don't believe he had. He ended up talking about them in court because I asked him about them in court. But the point was I gave him a heads up, but I had a forensic pathologist who was prepared to give evidence for the defence, and I showed him these articles and he said, to his credit, he said, good grief, he said, we were taught in medical school, these 3 signs means the baby's been shaken. He said, I didn't realise all this new stuff had come out. He sat down, did his homework, and having said initially he couldn't help me because it was going to be shaken baby and, the guy was guilty of sin, he was actually prepared to give evidence for the defence because he learned some more because the science had changed since these guys were in medical school. Couldn't get an ophthalmologist to help at all. When I say help, I mean review the file. I don't mean give a helpful opinion. I mean even look at it. And I'd get responses like, I'm on the baby's side. It's like, hello, I just want you to look at the file and tell me what you make of it. I'll take whatever you give me. Could not. And of course the retinal symptoms were said to be really, there's another word for it, but, a diagnostic of shaken baby syndrome. They were said to be very important. So, we eventually got to the trial, but before the trial, what's happening? There's this big publicity campaign about don't shake your babies and things like, let's do an experiment. This is in the media. Let's put an egg in a blender and turn the blender on. That's what happens to a baby's brain when you shake it. What? You get scrambled eggs.
It's not really an experiment.
It's not really an experiment. So one of the things we were lucky is we could actually avoid a jury because I was really worried that with this campaign going on at the time, how are we ever going to get a fair hearing? So we have had a judge-alone trial where it was just a judge. And, but in the meantime, I'm preparing for this trial. I've got people ringing me saying the kid's got scurvy. It's vitamin C deficiency. Okay, and scurvy can cause bleeding. You know that. Then I had someone else ring me saying, I'm a doctor. It's vaccinations. The anti-vaccination lobby got their mitts into it. It's vaccinations. And I'm going, yeah, okay. And this person, this doctor who rang me, I'm always suspicious if an expert rings me and volunteers. I'm going,
they've got an agenda.
There's something happening here. I actually did do my due diligence and dug up this expert's qualifications, and it turned out that they were a doctor of geology from an Eastern Bloc university of which I'd never heard. So I sort of got rid of that person, wanted to find a haematologist, actually found one in the end, and it turned out one of the things we could have been useful. There's a test that can be done to find out whether the baby has a problem with clotting in its blood. For what it's worth, it's called D-dimer, but it doesn't matter what it's called. It's a clotting test, if you like. And when the baby died, the baby actually did have a clotting deficiency. And when you've got symptoms that involve bleeding and we've got a clotting problem, you think, is that how it happened? Maybe the bleeding causes swelling and, maybe it all happened like a cascade.
And the retinal hemorrhaging.
Yeah. But, of course, I didn't know whether the baby had that problem when it was admitted, because that condition can result from some forms of treatment as well because of the amount of intervention that happened. So I wanted to know, and I was told it's not our job to collect defence evidence, so we didn't do that test. So we never knew. And when you think with something involving bleeding that you would actually look at that question, I wouldn't know, but common sense would suggest that. So all these things coming out, and I'm thinking, the more I learn, the more I thought, what else don't I know? We came to trial and I still wasn't feeling very confident because we still had the forensic pathologist saying, yes, the child was definitely shaken. He was relying on the ophthalmologist. I couldn't get anybody to even give advice on that. And, my heart was in my mouth. I was going to give it my best shot. And I remember there was an ophthalmologist giving evidence for the prosecution, and I'd seen what he was going to say. I mean, they don't keep secrets. You know what they're going to say. So I knew what he was supposed to say, and he just wasn't quite saying it. And he kept shuffling papers, and I don't want to sound like someone off the castle, but there was a vibe. There just was. Something weird was going on. And so when it came my time to question him, I did that biggest sin of all. I asked him a question I didn't know the answer to. It wasn't even really a question. I said, "Doctor, something seems to be bothering you," which is a totally unheard of lawyer question. And he said, "Yes." I almost said, "What seems to be the problem?" But I thought, no, that would be very tacky of me to say that. So I said, "Well, what is it? What's been bothering you?" Having no idea and thinking, this is like, I've just thrown a hand grenade. I don't know whether it's going to blow me up or someone else up. And he said, yes. He said, since I gave my opinion, he said, I've done a lot more research. Oh, right. He said, yes. And he said, I'm not as certain as I was now. And I'm going, oh, you can imagine how I was feeling because my heart was pounding. And clearly it was a surprise to the prosecutor because he was trying to act as if this was all expected, but I can imagine what was happening inside his head. He said, yes. He said, I found out that during the treatment in hospital, the baby developed a form of diabetes from the treatment, and diabetes insipidus, I think it was called. And he said diabetes can produce retinal hemorrhaging, which can, wait for it, mimic shaken baby syndrome. I just about fell over. And I looked around. There was a police officer who was in charge of gathering all the evidence in the back of the court, and the public couldn't see him, but I could see him, and he mouthed an extremely rude word because this is their crucial witness that everyone else has relied on, and he's just said the treatment could have produced the very thing that we're now saying proves father killed the baby. And I was like, whoa. Anyway, it proceeded, and our forensic pathologist also gave evidence that he'd read all this material and that he couldn't say that father had shaken the baby, that it was dangerous to say that. And then I cross-examined the forensic pathologist for the state, and I said to him, in light of everything you've heard in court, are you prepared to say that this child must have been shaken? I had to ask him 4 or 5 times, and really I had this image of putting a pin through an insect or something. And I ended up saying, are you prepared to say that this must have been due to shaking of any form? And he said, it was then I wished I had a jury, he said, the jury's still out. That was the prosecution case. The jury's still out. So, as you'd expect, the judge acquitted him and said, not only do I harbour doubt, which is all you need in a criminal case, he basically said, I actually think it is likely that what happened was father whacked the baby between the shoulder blades, and this produced this cascade of things that flowed from that, and that what happened was a terrible tragedy. So he was saying not just, I'm finding this man not guilty because I have doubt. I read him as saying, not only am I finding him not guilty, but I think he's innocent. And there's a difference.
It was a big difference.
There's a huge difference. But you know what? While he was in jail, the older child was taken away from mum because the department decided the older child was at risk. The child was then returned to mum, but when dad got out of jail, they took the child away again, the older child, saying that the child is in jeopardy because they had a different standard of proof called, I don't know, suspicion or something. They didn't say that. That's my interpretation. So they took the older child away. So we were going to have another trial about getting the child back. The prosecution also appealed the acquittal, but their first ground of appeal was that the accused had failed to provide an alternative explanation. And I'm going, there's a thing called you're supposed to prove it beyond reasonable doubt. We're not obliged, and nor can we say what happened.
You don't even have to offer a defence.
No, you don't have to say anything. You can say, look, there's a prosecution case, that's not enough. I could not believe that. And that, for me, was because of the amount of emotion tied up, that this elementary law school 101 appeal ground was being put up. And I mean, I haven't talked about the emotion, but, everyone was emotional. I've been to conferences, like I was a member of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, and they had sessions on shaken baby syndrome, and you had two sets of doctors calling each other whores and almost coming to blows about this sort of thing because people are so emotional, and so they should be. We're talking babies' lives. But you've got to put that away if you're trying to objectively look at what might have happened. But as you can see from the way I'm talking now, I could burst into tears right now about it because of all the awful things that happened, and awful things that happened to that family, but also the fact that you can't not ever charge anybody because the science isn't stable. You can't let baby killers get away with it if they've deliberately killed their children.
And there have been, I think we should probably say, there have been people who've admitted to violently shaking and assaulting babies who have had that syndrome.
Yeah. Well, and normally what you'll also see is injuries, and see, I haven't mentioned that there were no injuries, external injuries on this child at all. There weren't even bruises around his rib cage. If you're going to hold a 10-month-old baby hard enough to shake it that hard,
you'd
expect to see bruises, you'd leave marks. And very often it's combined with throwing the baby to the floor or something. So there's
another trauma.
Yeah, other trauma obvious. There was no trauma whatever. So that made this case very much more just about those three symptoms. There was no other evidence. The wife stood by the husband. Nobody had seen anything happen. There was no indication. It was purely about that.
Often people say, you'd rather one guilty person go free than convict an innocent person.
Rather 10 go free, in fact, is what they're saying. 10
go free rather than convict an innocent person. But when it comes to dead babies, it's almost as though it's the inverse. We'd rather convict 10 innocent people to make sure we catch that child killer.
That's right. And that's because of how close to our hearts it is. But it's a conundrum we haven't got an answer to. The science, we're still learning. We don't know. And something that's true one year, like the ulcer thing, like the heart attack thing, may not be true next year. What's a fact? What's truth? What's proof? Brings all of that stuff up. And I can't give you any answers. I just know that we should be very, very careful. Experts should be super careful that they're right up to speed. The lawyers should be super careful. The judges should be super careful about what evidence they admit and what they don't. They wouldn't let a GP who'd made a career-long study of shaken baby syndrome give evidence because it was said he's not a specialist, so he can't be an expert. Now, in my view, that's rubbish. He's actually far better equipped than I was to wrap his head around all these areas of medicine, pull them all together and make sense of them. And he said, because we pretend to have certainty where there is none, we're harming innocent people. And I think that's very well put. We pretend that we know, and we don't.
This case happened in the early 2000s, I understand.
Yes.
So do you acknowledge how have the courts changed the way they addressed shaken baby syndrome, and how has it evolved since then?
It's ebbed and flowed. There are still people being charged. The debate still goes on. I took the trouble because, as you've probably realised, I do tend to do my homework and had a look at the current state of play. And it's still, to be honest, exactly where it was. That there's a school of thought that says, yes, this must have been a deliberate shaking. School of thought saying it might not be, and it could be all sorts of other reasons. And it's still an emotional field. I'm sad to say I don't really believe it has progressed very much. There's probably now a stronger and more rigorous amount of expert opinion casting doubt on the syndrome. I've got to say that, but there are still people being prosecuted and being convicted today based on very similar evidence to what I had in this case, because it's such a difficult area, and also because of how hard it is to do experiments. As I said earlier, you can't just go and shake babies. And again, when you don't know you're looking for something, you may not be doing the right test. You'll be saving the child's life if you can. You won't be necessarily thinking, oh, I'd better collect some evidence in case this man's charged or this woman's charged that might be of assistance to the defence. It's correct. That's not their job. But it's a real pity.
They should be considering all possibilities.
Yes, but if they're trying to save lives, what worries me is the two roles are wrapped up in one. The person saving a child's life is also accidentally or deliberately collecting evidence which can be used in a prosecution. It would be good if there was some other person with an evidence collecting role, but then that almost presupposes that the doctor is deciding that someone's going to get charged. And there's problems with that too.
And your duty of care is to save that life and
Absolutely.
do no harm.
Yes.
That is the first priority. And I'd still like to see it stay that way
as
the very first duty of care.
Yeah. But then, as I said, then you get tripped up because suddenly you're testifying in court. And you might think to yourself as a doctor who's looked after this child, gosh, if I'd known this was going to happen, perhaps I could have collected this or done that or kept this sample, or even the fact that we couldn't tell whether the child had a bleeding problem to start with, the fact that it was more good luck than anything that the ophthalmologist did some more homework and looked at the fact that this form of diabetes, which was produced by the treatment, I didn't know that. That's something in a way I kicked myself that I didn't find that out. That was luck. That's probably why I get the hairs stand up on the back of my arms, because that was just sheer luck that this chap had done his homework. And his ego wasn't such that he wasn't going to admit. He volunteered that in the witness box. And, that's a whole different question too, is should experts volunteer something if they weren't actually asked a particular question? They're in the courtroom, they're in the lawyer's playground. You just answer the questions, doctor. You're not here to make speeches. If he hadn't done that, it could have been a hugely different outcome. And still in the end, there's a grieving family who've lost their baby, who've been at risk of losing their older child, who've been separated by imprisonment.
And are now left with the judge's comment that what the father did most likely
was
innocent, but contributed to his child's death.
That's right.
And he has to live with that forever.
That's right. It's just because of the human aspects. Every case has human aspects. It's just this one really brings them up. And it was all about the science in the end. So the doctors weren't deciding the case, but they were providing the information that was going to decide it. There's a pretty thin line, isn't there?
Judith, this has been incredibly fascinating and informative, and it's so rare for us when we focus on science to actually speak to someone who's been on the legal side as well as the scientific side. Thank you so much for all the work you've done, and I have so much respect for your research powers and your determination and perseverance. So thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, and I'm just really glad I could talk about this. It's been great therapy anyway.
Crime Insiders Forensics is a LiSTNR original production. It's hosted by me, Kathryn Fox, and is produced by Ed Gooden. Sound design and imaging is by Link Kelly.